Hey everyone, welcome back. In this lecture, let's explore the types of exception in Java. In Java, the exceptions are divided into two broad categories: checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions. The checked exceptions are checked at the compile time, whereas the unchecked exceptions are exceptions that are not checked at the compile time. They are also known as the runtime exceptions. But to understand them better, we must know the exception class hierarchy in Java. In Java, the throwable class provides the capabilities to allow the language to throw exceptions. So the throwable class is the superclass of all errors and exceptions in Java. The errors essentially are the problems related to the JVM, like the out of memory error, stack overflow error, etc. But one important thing to note here is you should never try to catch errors in your program. Okay, so that's errors. So now let's explore the exception hierarchy further. Exception is another subclass of throwable which indicates some problem in your code you might want to catch. Now, there are many subclasses of the exception class, for example, IO exception and many more. And then we have the runtime exception, which is another subclass of the exception class. So this is the exception hierarchy you must know. So now the question is, how can we identify which are checked exceptions and which are unchecked exceptions? Well, it's quite easy. All the exceptions which are subclass of the runtime exception are unchecked exceptions, and all the remaining exceptions which are not subclass of the runtime exceptions are checked exceptions. Okay, now let's summarize the difference between the checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions. So the checked exceptions are direct subclass of the exception class, whereas the unchecked exceptions are subclass of the runtime class. The checked exceptions are checked at the compile time, whereas the unchecked exceptions are ignored during the compile time and only occurs during the runtime execution. Few examples of checked exceptions are IO exception, SQL exception, class not found exceptions, and there are many more. And few examples of unchecked exceptions are null pointer exception, array index out of bound exception, and many more. So now that we know the differences between checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions, let's look at few examples. So let's understand unchecked exception example with this code. So here we have the divide method, which may throw arithmetic exception if b is 0. And here we are catching the arithmetic exception and then printing the message inside the catch block. Now let's try to run this program, and we see that there was an arithmetic exception when we tried to divide 10 by 0, but then the exception was caught, and that is why the program execution did not stop here and all these lines were executed. And we know that the arithmetic exception is an unchecked exception. Why? Because arithmetic exception extends runtime exception, which means even if we don't handle the arithmetic exception, the compiler won't complain. So let's just get rid of the try catch block. So we have now removed the try catch block and we are no longer handling the arithmetic exception. So now let's try to run this program. And now we see that the exception is not handled and the program crashed at this line, which means the unchecked exceptions, even though they are not checked by the compiler, should be handled. Otherwise your program will crash and the next lines would not be executed. Now this is a very important point to remember, that even though unchecked exceptions are not checked by the compiler, it is a good practice to handle unchecked exceptions to identify possible bugs in your code. Okay, so that's about the unchecked exceptions. Now let's look at an example of checked exception. In this code, we have the read file method. In this method, we have two compilation error. First, here the file reader, it actually throws a file not found exceptions, which we are not handling, and then the readline method, which throws the IO exception, which we are not handling in this code. And both of these are checked exceptions, and that is why it is not compiling. So let's fix this code. So first let's try to handle the file not found exception. So we can just surround with try catch, and let's also put this line inside the try block, and this now throws the IO exception. So let's try to also add a catch block for the IO exception, and let's also try to log the message of these two exceptions. So there you have it. We are now catching both the exceptions and the code is compiling properly. And let's now run the code, and we see that even though this file does not exist, the file not found exception was handled successfully. So the important thing to note here is you must handle checked exceptions in Java, or else your code will not compile. Okay, so the key concept you must remember here is the checked exceptions are checked at compile time, whereas the unchecked exceptions are ignored during the compile time and only occurs during the runtime execution. But whether it is checked or unchecked exception, you must handle both the types of exception in your application, or else your application will crash. So that's all in this video. If you learned something new, consider subscribing the channel. To learn more, check out codex.com. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.